Hello and welcome to the Completed Life Initiative's latest symposium, Last Hellos, New Models in Global End-of-Life Care. This symposium asks the question, how do we navigate one of life's most transformative experiences, our dying?
Drawing inspiration from Australian poet Les Murray's observation that these kind of questions summon last hellos. Today's Global Symposium welcomes speakers from Australia to Belgium, the United States to Rwanda, as we explore new models in end-of-life and palliative care.
From the origin of what it means to be palliative in the context of Aboriginal communities, to the scientific inquiry into the effect of placebos, from research into personal narratives of end-of-life visions, to expanding eligibility considerations for medical aid in dying. This two-day symposium invites you to contemplate one of life's most powerful transformative experiences.
Your presence in this virtual space means a lot to us, and we are grateful for you tuning in today. Be sure to stay till the end of this presentation, as there will be an opportunity for you to join a Completed Life Initiative team member and your fellow symposium attendees at our virtual event cafe. Thanks for joining.
Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Last Hellos, New Models in Global End-of-Life Care. The theme of today's first session asks the question, do deathbed visions make our lives complete? I am honored to welcome my guest, Dr. Christopher Kerr. Dr. Kerr is the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Executive Officer at Hospice and Palliative Care Buffalo. Born and raised in Toronto, Canada, Dr. Kerr earned his MD and PhD in neurobiology. His passion is palliative care and a belief that such care should be throughout the continuum of illness. Under Dr. Kerr's medical leadership, Hospice Buffalo now serves 1,200 patients a day, the majority of whom receive services upstream of hospice care. Dr. Kerr's background in research has evolved from bench science towards the human experience of illness as witnessed from the bedside, specifically patients' experiences at the end of life. To date, the research team at Hospice Buffalo has published multiple studies on this topic and documented over 1,500 end-of-life events, many of which are videotaped. This work was the subject of his TEDx Buffalo talk, which has been viewed 5.3 million times. It has been the subject of numerous reports around the world, as well as the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other notable publications. It is also featured in a recent docuseries on Netflix called Surviving Death, and a PBS documentary called Death is But a Dream. Dr. Kerr's work has also been published in a book entitled Death is But a Dream by Penguin Random House, which was released in 2020 and published in over 10 different languages. Welcome, Dr. Kerr. It's wonderful to have you today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So in your book, Death is But a Dream, Finding Hope and Meaning at Life's End, you write that end-of-life experiences are circuitous, enmeshed, relational, even protracted. In your experience with countless patients at the end of life, what are end-of-life dreams? Namely, what are they actually about?
I think they're part of this larger process that occurs in dying, this kind of introspective and reflective process. The vantage point is unique, and it kind of makes sense that you draw back and reflect on life. I think ultimately what it becomes is a reaffirmation of the life that was led. You tend to focus on the things that matter most. In that sense, you're kind of put back together and made whole. So I think two things are happening. Life's reaffirmed, and in that process, the fear of death seems to diminish.
There's this just mass green, like a pasture of like green, green grass. But again, hard to describe because it was a color green that I've never seen before. It was so vivid and so, it was like lifelike. Um, and it just, it felt good. My wife all of a sudden appeared, and I'm thinking, well, this is even better yet. She had a certain smile about her that it was probably like a joke. It was like I got you. And I'm like, what is the joke? What do you know? Why can't you talk to me? She just, there's just no conversation.
Yeah.
Well, she was always beautiful to me, but she was even prettier. She was. She knew me inside out. Yeah. Or maybe that, I guess maybe words weren't necessary. We just looked at each other and knew exactly what one was thinking. It was just a good time with, I don't know, but everything had left you, like there was no problems, everything was, everything was happiness. It was like you wish the world was really, felt good.
Yeah.
Felt like there was, when you finish paying a bill that had been bugging you for years.
Relief.
It was that relief that it was gone. And it was, it was just a relief. Everything was okay.
What you get from this is so fascinating is time and distance seem to vanish. So they're not experiencing these events from a perspective of illness and of loss or of diminishing. Instead, they're focused on the more vibrant and life-affirming and love-rich aspects of having lived. So there's this paradox within dying where people are physically lessening and diminishing, but spiritually, psychologically, it's quite the opposite. So you'll often hear patients describe an existence with their eyes closed that's absolutely contrary to what we see objectively. And I think that's what we get wrong at the bedside. I mean, we're struck by what we see and our own sense of loss, but the patient themselves is having an entirely different inner experience.
That's really powerful. And walk us through, how did you dive into this exploration through your research with your team at Hospice Buffalo? It's such an incredible offering to not only study end-of-life visions, but also to really tap into each patient's humanity, and then a step further to have them each say yes to being videotaped as they describe these experiences. What was that like for you and your team, and how did you get started?
Well, it's actually a story onto a story within a story. I wish I could tell you it was a predetermined, well thought out path, but it was quite the opposite. I was actually a cardiology fellow and was moonlighting and saw an ad in the paper for a hospice doctor, and came here pretty unprepared. And it was really my colleagues in other disciplines who brought me reluctantly to the bedside to show me that there was this other aspect of dying, the experiential, the one the patient was experiencing. And from there, I was trying to teach young doctors about the importance of patient's experience. And I was met with a lot of resistance. There's no evidence for it. It didn't make sense in an objective way. And because of that, I went about seeking the evidence. The irony is I never thought it would get published or matter. And it didn't really in the medical community, but what's fascinating is it's gone, of course, around the world and doesn't stop. So there's this disconnect between what is important then to the receivers of care or people who are ill and the people who are providing care. So that's how it came about, was basically to provide some evidence for what we've always known. There's nothing new in our work. It's still central to many cultures around the world. It's always been talked about, particularly in the humanities, less so within medicine.
Thank you for sharing, and that's a great sneak peek into your origin story in this work. So thank you for that. I'm just so curious and have so many questions about the work that you're doing, and so in awe of what you and your team have opened up for the larger world to experience through not only your TED Talk, but also your book and other interviews that you've done, and through our conversation today. And I'm curious what the power of these dreams hold for each of your patients and what you've discovered in being a companion to them through these experiences. What role do these end-of-life dreams play for your patients?
I think, again, it's this notion of being put back together. It's not random, for example, that they tend to focus on people's greatest accomplishments, which is their relationships. And most importantly, on people who they've loved and they lost. And what's fascinating is there's this almost editing process. So people whose love was withheld or conditioned don't feature prominently, where people who are pivotal, who loved unconditionally, who secured you, they're featured. And so it's often one parent and not another, one sibling or not another. And interestingly, animals play a very prominent role, I think, based on the same sort of dynamic. But there's a purity in it, and they're certainly not random. They seem to forget or let go of the more harmful relationships and hang on to those they have, but they're tangible to them, and they're recalled as actual happenings rather than memories. When we ask them to describe the vividness or the realism, it's usually measured on a scale of 1 to 10. It's usually 10 out of 10. So these feel like they feel proximate to them. They're reacquainted again, and the time and the distance seems to have vanished.
That's just truly amazing. And my grandfather had an end-of-life vision where he, was dying of metastatic cancer, and I think 3 days before he died, he, of course, was bedbound, and he had been sleeping, and he woke up and he said, "Wait a minute, the mountains are covered in fog, and if you are patient, it will clear and we can see again." And that memory came back to me when I was reading your book, Death is But a Dream. And I'm wondering, have there been surprising moments with your patients where perhaps in your research mode, you were moving through the process of working with each patient and creating a theory of sorts of how these dreams were manifesting? And then were there surprising moments that caught you off guard or caused you to question your theories?
Yeah, and it's hard to capture the potency of this unless you're there, but to see somebody, for example, who's late in age, in their 90s, and they lost a parent when they were a child, and they describe the scene they're in the kitchen. the smell of a perfume, a voice saying "I love you," the vividness, the richness, the meaning is hard to describe. I also am particularly moved by the more what we categorize as negative sort of experiences, because these tend to reflect the life that was led, and everyone's been harmed and wounded in one way. And whatever those wounds were that were unaddressed or lingering often get addressed in some form at the end of life. You know, a man who lost his arm as a boy, blue collar neighborhood, wondered, you know, how was he going to cope and be independent? At the end of his life, all of his coworkers come to him and tell him he was the best worker. The World War II veteran who had survivor's guilt, all the years of therapy or whatever unaddressed at the end of his life and kind of the final days, they come to him and relieve him of the burden. The power, I guess, of these to be self-healing, to address these wounds after a long life where no other intervention, the power was always, the capacity to heal was always there. And so I think people leave us in a sense more put back together than apart, which is kind of a better story, I think. And but yeah, in the moment, it's pretty remarkable to witness.
And are you able to tell the difference between one of your patients describing a regular dream versus an end-of-life vision? Like, how might you distinguish those two experiences and then a step further validate the end-of-life vision?
It's a great question. In fact, it comes up a lot because patients object to the term dreams and visions. And what we hear more often than not is, I don't normally dream, or I don't recall my dreams. So they're described as actual occurrences. So if we're to believe our patients, there's that argument. They're qualitatively distinct in that they're not metaphorical or fantastical, right? These are based on real events. They're recalled with absolute clarity. They offer insight and understanding. I've never had a patient ask for an interpretive analysis of any sort, which is just because life's closing. They shouldn't be left with questions, but with an answer. So they're entirely different. And again, when we ask patients to rate the reality, they give it a 10 out of 10 score most commonly. And they'll become very emphatic that you refer to them as anything but an occurrence. And they're most often struck by how virtual it feels.
So it sounds like almost as if that experience for them is quite real, and it's something they're excited to share with you. And then you can then capture on video in some cases. But what a remarkable occurrence, and what a remarkable opportunity that you've stepped into this world of tapping into patients' most intimate last moments.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up this idea of sharing. And I think there's, again, a great story here, is that we were originally denied permission to do the study because we have this notion that we've got to kind of sterilize and protect the dying. And in fact, every person approached participated, and many of them agreed to be videoed. And I think what's wonderful in that is that a couple of things matter. Is that people who are dying still want to be heard and to connect. They want to contribute. They know there's no secondary gain, that they're not going to see the outcome, but their words still matter to them, and they want to share. And I just think what was so remarkable is how honest they were, because this is the unvarnished truth, the pains of having lived, their sorrow, their longing for people who they've lost. All of it was fully disclosed. There's just such an honesty in it all, which was exactly the opposite of what everyone anticipated in this work.
And yet the power of research to go in with a particular question and come out with an entirely different and unexpected outcome, but a wonderful outcome. Recently, at the Completed Life Initiative, I wanted to share that we welcomed a music thanatologist, Catherine DeLong, who plays the harp as a person, to use her terminology, unbinds from this life. How do you experience the term unbinding with your experience with your patients?
I think it's similar in that it's spacious and spiritual. I think it's in that it allows you to get to true, is definitely part of letting go. I think the fact that, again, time seems to go, so you're unbound from the present and able to focus on really what had mattered. But I think in the overarching theme, it's more binding than it is unbinding. But it's certainly a form of release. Definitely it is from people who have been harmed, for whom they're stuck. They seem to be relieved of those sorts of fears. A mother who had a child in prison for drug-related offenses, and her whole identity as a parent was in question as she reflected on her life. And at her end of her life, her parents come to her and tell her she was a good mother. So in that sense, I think it's unbinding from pain.
How do these, well, first of all, you said your patients don't like using the term visions or dreams, so maybe there's another better phrase to use. What phrase could we use?
We often use end-of-life experiences.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for these end-of-life experiences, you mentioned there's a binding and then unbinding, and then an unbinding from pain. Can you describe that process a little bit further?
Again, I think there's this natural tendency to be reflective at that point. And we've all had loss and regret. And I think that's the spiritual healing that takes place, is there's some sort of release, for some sort of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a very, very common theme. But either way, you're unbound from those concerns in a way that brings comfort. And that's how most people, when we ask them to rate these experiences on a scale of 1 to 5, as 5 being the most comfortable, most typically 5. And what's interesting is that rating increases as they get closer to death. We did a very interesting study where we looked at dying as a process in which there was growth. So we use scales for post-traumatic growth. The idea that within a negative event, for example, war is often cited, there's also positive things like friendships, camaraderie, selflessness. And we used those scales. And what we found was really interesting is that people were adapting. There was spiritual growth. There was a better sense of self. There was understanding, which really is a challenge to this idea of dying, which is diminishing, when in fact people were growing and adapting and learning right up until the last days of life. So yeah, I think that's part of this process. They're gaining insight.
It's a pivotal moment to explore, and thank you for inviting us into that space. Is it fair to say then, in this context of healing as a byproduct perhaps, or a core component of this unbinding process through end-of-life experiences, that when a person is actively dying, they experience a series of perhaps self-disclosures is one way to describe it, or shedding in some ways, shedding the pain of loss, of trauma. How would you describe it?
I think that I think the sense of loss diminishes in simply that the distance seems to vanish. So the experience may be remote, but they're reacquainted or refamiliarized in a way with people that they've lost. I think I sent you the one video where this woman had lost her husband and her daughter, and they're sitting around a kitchen table. And again, nothing is rarely said at these moments. But again, she's surrounded and secured in the love that mattered most to her. So there's two things happening. She's experiencing the love, but she's also not experiencing a sense of loss or distance. So that matters. They're proximate. They're felt tangible again to them, and I think that's what the healing is.
Tell us about the dreams.
It's very hard to pinpoint because they were so real. And all these years, my husband's been dead and my daughter.
And when did your daughter pass?
7 years ago.
Okay, at the age of 37?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And your husband died?
61.
61, okay.
I have seen them, not their face, not their clothes, but I knew it was them. But there was nothing really remarkable to define that was Dick or John. But the other night, I fell right into a sleep. We were like sitting at the kitchen table, laughing. I could see their faces. I could tell it was their clothes. We were laughing, we were talking, we were eating. It was like a regular Sunday dinner night.
That's wonderful.
It is. And then Monday night, the same thing happened. But the same identical thing. We're laughing, we're talking, we're having a ball.
How did it make you feel?
I woke up Monday morning and I went, was that real? And I said, that was real. That was really real.
It happened.
We were sitting there as much as we were sitting here.
Okay. Have you ever had a dream that was that vivid?
No.
No. That was the most vivid dream. And we hear this a lot, and it's very hard to tell whether it's real or it's a dream. Yeah.
It made me feel like that whole 12 years had never existed.
12 years, that's interesting. 12 years since he's been gone. Okay. Because it was so real that he was there in the present.
And 7 years since my daughter was gone. Mm-hmm. It was like we were always together, never separated.
Yeah. How does it make you feel about the prospect of dying? How does it change your view?
I'm not afraid of dying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does it make you think you're going to see them?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If I quit swearing.
If you what?
Quit swearing.
Oh, you're worried you're going to end up in the wrong place. I have a feeling you're okay. It's interesting that you can be in a dying process and at the same time feeling very much alive, right? And that made you feel alive.
Okay.
I'm so curious about how healing emerges from this complete honesty, if you will, for each person, for themselves. They're embracing truth, but also embracing in that truth the pain, the regret, but also meaning. And at points in your book, you mention repentance. And I'm so eager to explore this area of healing for your patients and how that manifests in different ways. And so could you walk us through a little bit further how patients express that they've, through these end-of-life experiences, received a form of healing?
Yes. Would you like a kind of a case example?
Sure.
I'd like to share with you the story of Dwayne. He was in his 40s. He had head and neck cancer, and he had an open wound on his neck. And he had a very difficult life with multi-generational impoverishment and drug use, and he had spent more of his life in prison than out. And at the end of his life, he described horrific dreams where he was being stabbed at the site of his cancer by all those people who he had harmed. It was remarkable. Despite this sort of life, he was incredibly jovial, humor-filled, kind of didn't talk about any regrets until this moment came. And what happened is that he asked to see his daughter. And for the first time in his life, he said he was sorry, and he expressed how much he loved her. In terms of healing, it was remarkable because it's very hard to die if you can't sleep. And you can't sleep not only if you're physically comfortable, which everybody understands, but also psychologically if you're not at peace. And he couldn't sleep. He was tormented. And then his daughter came, and she describes the best hug of her life, and that he wouldn't let her go. And it was this honest moment of reckoning and of grace. And she never left his bedside, and he was able to fall asleep and die peacefully. So it is an example of there's this honest reflection of your life that seems to occur, and it doesn't deny the hard parts, but those are actually often the most transformational or transformative, and it's certainly for Dwayne.
Mm.
You know, I had a lot of good dreams that I was mad that I got woke up from, and I tried to hurry up, get back to sleep so I can get back into it, and I couldn't, you know, because it was a good one. My dreams, man, you know, my nightmares, I don't like them. I think it's because my past is coming back to me, you know, from doing wrong. Because I'm not going to say I'm the perfect guy when I was out there, because I was ripping, running the streets, you know, doing wrong to individuals that I knew I shouldn't have been doing wrong to. Now they caught up with me. And now they know my symptoms. They know I'm sick. So now they want to try to hurt me. You know, it was like they were jigging a knife, you know, trying to cut out, you know, my neck, where my cancer was at.
Right.
Stop trying to fight, you know. I'm sorry, you know, trying to fight this guy off from hurting him. That's scary. It's scary to me. I'm not a bad individual, man. Well, I done crossed a lot of people in my life, you know, and I need help. I need help, you know. I don't want to live my life being out in society walking, have to look over my back, man. I just want people to forgive me. And please know that I was sick at the time when I was doing certain things that was hurting them and their families. You know, that's all I want. I don't want them to look at me as a bad individual, because I'm not. You know, I need help. I need help.
In the midst of me taking my plea, you know, the judge, they let me out. They petitioned to let me out on an ankle bracelet. And at that time, like, I hadn't known who got me out. I thought it was my attorney. And comes to find out, it wasn't even my attorney. It was Chris. I had went and I came through the front door. And when I turned the corner, like, he was just walking with his walker, and I said, "Hey, old man." And it was like, I guess he heard my voice and he just like froze and like stuck, and he lifted his head up and he moved that walker and he snatched away from her and he just started walking towards me all fast. And we just like stood there for, I want to say like 3-4 minutes, and we just cried. He just Like kept saying like how sorry he was and like he didn't mean it. And I just told him, don't worry about it. I'm home. You know, I don't even care about that. That was the only because I actually really ever hugged my dad. Ever. In life. Like I've hugged my dad all the time, but standing there hugging him for that long again. Like my family always, oh, you just worship him like he just hello, yeah, that's my dad.
I'm thinking through, all of the many challenges that life can present. And Dwayne is such a incredible story of both challenge and um, healing through transformation. And I'm curious, are there other transformative elements that come along with these end-of-life experiences for your patients? It sounds like there's a sense of accompaniment. Um, how do animals come into the equation here?
I think it's fascinating. I think they occurred in 35% of our respondents as being prevalent. Again, what's fascinating, it could be the dog from childhood. But it is, if you think of animals, they are a source of this unconditional love and joy. And they figure very prominently in people's dreams. I think you saw it in Florence's case. She even said, I know I'm not at the end until I've seen my dog. And sure enough, she saw her dog.
So in terms of animal experiences, if you will, does it typically tend to be in your patients' experiences, household pets, dogs, cats, perhaps rabbits, birds? Are there other kinds of animals that show up, perhaps horses or?
Yeah, they are. They figure very prominently. We've written case series about this in children, because clearly one of the things that is happening is the presence of the deceased bring a level of comfort and security. And for children may not have known a person who has died, but they generally know of an animal, whether it was theirs, a neighbor's, a grandma, they'll know of an animal that has passed. Of course, children are much better at not drawing distinctions between the animal and the human world, so they'll often include them. And what's fascinating is we would ask the children, what was the significance of the dog or the parrot or the ferret? And it was a couple of things. One, they saw them in health. So they were seeing them, there was a new memory made where they were vibrant and full of life. But they said two things. They said, it means I'm not alone, and it means that I'm loved. So the source of love was less the issue. It was more that they were loved.
That's a comforting thought to both know that, each person is loved in their own way and that they have the potential to be reminded of that at the end of life.
Well, and as importantly is that they're not alone, right?
Mm.
One thing that comes out clearly in our work is that people leave us more together and more in the company of people they've loved than they do alone.
Mm-hmm.
So while dying itself may be isolating, the
Mm.
experience of it isn't.
Mm. And that's such a powerful realization for your research to come to and to showcase through the experiences of your patients, because most folks that I've either talked to or heard about have indicated a heightened sense of fear around dying. And so I'm curious, based upon what you've uncovered through these end-of-life visions, how might you walk someone through that fear process?
It, It's interesting. It takes care of itself. There's a quote, fret not, nature will take care of it, from a philosopher. I think that's actually the most interesting thing that was not measured, but that comes out. If you watch our videos, what's striking is the absence of fear. And I think that there's the dying that we fear and imagine, which is, of course, critical to our survival, this innate ability to fight against all things, the dying of the light. But I think Dylan Thomas had it wrong. We don't see patients fighting that fight, the dying of the light. It's quite the opposite. And I think that's actually the most interesting aspect of our work. If you were to just view the video footage, that's not where people are coming from. Obviously, there's fear of death that comes with a diagnosis. There's a fear of death with illness, and you work through the various aspects. But illness is hard. People are tired. They experience something that we can't imagine, where it's okay and feels better to sleep than to be awake, to talk less than to talk. And something happens where they start to have this other experience. And in that, they, again, are comfortable and connected, and they don't speak of fear. It's not uncommon to see patients who are having these experiences and prefer their experience when their eyes were closed. But fear does not seem, and that's actually one of the questions we're asking in this next study, is, we've kind of shown that this occurs and its frequency, but what is the translational meaning to the person? How are they left feeling spiritually, and in terms of what their interpretation is of what's happening? But fear does not seem to be the symptom we're seeing.
It's incredible. It's just truly incredible, and it gives me goosebumps thinking about that possibility for each person.
Well, when you think about people who died, your grandfather, was fear in his vocabulary?
No.
No. It's one of the kind of the frustrations of doing this work. There are questions that we don't have answers for, and I think that's okay. Maybe we're not meant to know. I think where we end up is just at a point of reverence, and it's incredibly powerful for those left behind, like yourself. So you saw someone who you loved leave, but they didn't leave frightened. And they were seeing and feeling something else that brought them meaning. And I think that's what our patients are telling us is, and it's not demonic, it's not evil, but whatever it is soothing to them. They have solace in the end.
Well, you raised an interesting point. My grandfather was in his mid-80s. He was a World War II vet, an artist, a man of all trades in many ways, and he had lived a full and complete life. And he, at different points in his active dying process, he kept saying, "I quit, I quit." And I think he knew that he was ready to go. And so after he passed, even though it was incredibly sad, I was the closest with him. And everyone in the family mourned his passing. It felt like he had done everything that he wanted to do, and he was ready to go and to transition and to die. And that's been a big contrast, a notable contrast. And the contrasting example I'll give is the story of my aunt, and I'm sure many of those who've loved and lost aunts and uncles and other family members who've died relatively too soon. She was 57 when she passed from metastatic breast cancer, triple negative, that was a very aggressive onset, and she died within a year of her self-diagnosis. And so she was not ready to go. She kept denying the fact, actually. And so I don't know if she had any end-of-life experiences that helped her resolve the denial and the perhaps anger and rage that I imagine that she was feeling, that she expressed in different ways, through not expecting to keep ending up back in the hospital, which is where she passed. When she went into the hospital for the last time, she fully expected to come out. And so I'm really curious, have you experienced patients like that who were not ready to die, who perhaps they shared an end-of-life vision, but there was still something unresolved?
Oh yeah, I had a woman like that last week, and she was around the same age, and um, she was somebody for whom illness was just an affront to who she was. It was antithetical to everything. And just like somebody at 47, they had never had a chance to age or decline. Um, the I think their death for people who have unfinished lives, who are still raising children, for example, it has an entirely different. Um, it's an entirely different experience, and I think again, pe- people's dying experiences tends to be their authentic self. So she was somebody, and I think one of the problems is we try to impart on people one approach when the individuality is what matters. So she wasn't going to have find this tranquil point. Who she was, this was an objection, and she was going to fight, and she was offended by the illness. Yeah, and that's okay too. But that happens. It's certainly rarer, but it happens. The patient I had last week, I was concerned just because there were people around her who were trying to get her to a different place, and I don't think that's our job necessarily.
And it brings to mind, for folks who are struggling with significant memory loss, whether they have a dementia diagnosis or Alzheimer's diagnosis or some other form of memory impairment. And I'm wondering, Chris, can reminders in the present of past memories help your patients or every patient create a meaningful end-of-life reality?
Oh yeah, I mean, we get so much wrong when we talk to about people who are cognitively different. I mean, medically, the currency we talk about them is of their deficit, right? And they may have a cognitive limitation or deficit, but that doesn't obscure their emotional or personal histories, past and memory. And there's something very important in the fact that you can have a 85-year-old demented woman who may not remember what she had for breakfast, but absolutely remembers what she wore to her prom date, decades and decades earlier. And I think you want to put people back in a context, or place people in a context where memories and feelings are rekindled. And that happens all the time. I mean, that's one of the gifts of music therapy. I've seen people who are minimally verbal be sparked into language when the right song came on. I mean, neurologic brain function is complex, and emotional history and memory can be triggered by all sorts of things. There's a great story of a man who was caring for his demented wife, and their favorite thing was to go camping, canoeing. And so, and it was in the excitement. It was kind of like a Christmas Day thing. They were building and they'd be all ready. And so, what he would do every day is he'd put the canoe on the car, park the car by their kitchen window. So she'd come down for breakfast and she thought she was going camping. So, but we have some of the richest stories we have are of in this work have been with people with dementia. There's a great story. We have the video of a woman who, as she was getting closer to dying, actually was much more engaged and living within the memory of her deceased husband, to the point that she was in a long-term care facility, and the daughter who's on the video got called because she was trying to get out. She was trying to get out of the building because she was going to her wedding. She had so utterly reconnected and recontextualized herself and her emotional past again within the best parts of living, that's where she was.
What you've shared is yet another reminder that there's so much that it seems that common medical care takes for granted or overlooks in individual patient experiences. So thank you for uncovering that for us. And I'm also struck by the painting of a canoe behind you. Within the pages of your book, at one point, there's a phrase that end-of-life dreams and visions are safe, sustaining, and complete. And so as we conclude today, Chris, do our deathbed visions make our lives complete?
Yes. I think in the sense that how our lives are defined again by the people we're connected to. We develop within our relationships. We're defined. Our memories of love are within those relationships, and they're not many, but they're pivotal. And the fact that those come back to us in ways that are meaningful and tangible um, means that is, I think, what exactly what is happening. Yeah.
Well, I want to extend my tremendous gratitude and thanks for our conversation today. And thank you again so much for your presence, Dr. Kerr. It's been an honor to have you join our Last Hello Symposium.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated.
Of course. And thank you all in the audience for tuning in today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Stay tuned.